Next panel will turn our focus squarely to international issues, and this panel will be chaired by Jeff Gracer of Cy Padgett and Rizal. And if folks who know the firm, it's been certainly one of the leaders in environmental law over the years. Jeff's practice covers climate change issues, environmental issues more broadly, including things like brownfields development, and he's working on now, relevant to this discussion, a pro bono project internationally with the Rainforest Alliance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon. Hopefully the subdued lighting will not put everyone asleep. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists on the international issues, and not in the order they will be speaking. To my right is Ellie Baroudi, who is the biocarbon fund manager at the World Bank, who, as I think she said to me a minute ago, is spending 90% of her time on forestry issues at the bank. She grew up in Lebanon. She is also at the World Bank team leader for the 10 Kyoto funds. So she's really right at the center of both the CDM efforts on forestry and also the emerging efforts on deforestation. She got a PhD in freshwater ecology from Windermere, which is, I am informed, is in the UK. And we're very happy to have her here and thank her for coming up from Washington. To my left is Julie Baroudi from the Rainforest Alliance, who I had the pleasure of working with on a pro bono matter over the past few years. Julie, as I understand it, essentially created the climate change coordinator position for the Rainforest Alliance. The Rainforest Alliance has been pioneering voluntary certification in forestry, agriculture, and tourism. And now Julie is spearheading their efforts to add on the climate change and carbon overlay to what they've been doing. And she's doing a lot of really interesting work. And then to my far left is Don Brown, who will start off. Don is an associate professor of environmental ethics, science, and law at Penn State University. And he's also a program director of the collaborative program on the ethical dimensions of climate change. He's the author of a recent book called American Heat: Ethical Problems with the U.S. Response to Global Warming. And he was previously at the EPA, where he was involved in international negotiations. So I think Don's insights in particular on REDD and where those negotiations are and what the issues are will be particularly interesting. So with that, I'll turn it over to Don.
Oops. Thanks, Jeff. I'm delighted to be here on such an amazingly unfolding, thick with policy implications issues, and I'm really glad to be on panel with two people on the ground looking at this at a different level than I'm looking at. I'm looking at it in terms of its integration into the international system. So what I intend to do is to introduce at a pretty high level, what is this thing called REDD? What is it? Where is it going? What does it intend to do? And what are the challenges? REDD is, of course, a program that is designed to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, where mostly people in developed countries fund projects to stop deforestation. So the basic idea is that people in developed countries, for the most part, pay for projects in developing countries. Now, why is this thing necessary? And I want to dwell a little bit on this. It's despite all of the policy challenges that REDD creates, and I think they're just mind-blowing in terms of each one of them is significant, how you structure this. Most people think we have to go ahead with this, and this train is on the track. And I believe that some form of REDD will evolve starting in Copenhagen, probably slowly, but into something a more integrated, most likely with the international framework in the years in the future. And the reason for that is most people look at the amazing amount of carbon reductions that the world needs. And as most of the people in the room probably know, that most consensus scientists are almost every day more alarmed about the reductions that we need to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that don't create catastrophic or dangerous interference with the climate system. So one of the reasons why REDD is getting support is people are saying there's no way that we're going to solve this problem unless we tackle the forests. This chart shows you emissions from all sources, and the green here is land use change, and forests are by far the largest share of that. The forest sector alone is almost equal to what the world can tolerate from emissions if we want to stabilize greenhouse gases. And so the Europeans in particular are saying, whoa, we really have to get on this forest. There's no hope of avoiding dangerous climate change. Even though there are thorny policy issues, we must do this. They're just, as I like to say, it is a can of worms, but we have to eat that can of worms, in my view. So there are reasons why people justify REDD. The first, at the top of the list, it's absolutely necessary to solve the climate problem. People also argue that it will help solve biodiversity. It will help with other sustainable development objectives. Those two claims are contested, though. It all depends upon what form it takes. If, in fact, REDD, for instance, winds up supporting plantations, then maybe it doesn't help with biodiversity. So the devil is in the details about, in my view, whether all of these other claims about co-benefits of REDD will, in fact, happen. So most of many countries in the world, particularly it's been the Europeans, although the U.S. has been on board with most of this most recently, are supporting REDD. Couple of terms you have to understand to sort of get this. You have to understand the difference between afforestation and reforestation, which are in the international system in this CDM already. They have been there since shortly after the Kyoto Protocol. But deforestation is not in the system, and this is largely about deforestation. And why has deforestation not been in the system? Well, most people, there are really challenging methodological questions that deforestation presents that afforestation and reforestation don't present in the same starkness that deforestation creates. People are particularly worried about leakage. Leakage is, okay, so you preserve this forest in this particular place, but right next door people move and they continue with their logging or deforestation practices. So one of the challenges, and the reason why this was not in the CDM, is largely because worries about how to sort of design a system that would deal with leakage. And a lot of people are worried about all of this creating disincentives for people that are actually emitting emissions to give them economic incentives not to reduce emissions at the time when we desperately need people to reduce emissions from other sources. So that's largely why the CDM was opposed. I think it was actually in the Hague COP in about 7 years ago, and never made it into the CDM. What are the methodological problems? Well, there are huge issues about baselines. Presenting emissions reductions from what? Okay, what year? What is the measurement of it? Is it the historic rate of deforestation? Is it a rate of deforestation? And what's so interesting about this program, all of these choices have policy significance in terms of who the winners and losers are. So if you look at historic rate of emissions as your baseline, as I will show, some countries benefit, other countries are losers. Each choice creates different sets of winners and losers. Leakage, as I mentioned, is a huge challenge, and as a result of that, not only are nations fighting about the details of that, but many of the environmental NGOs are fighting about the details of this. Most environmental NGOs support country or regional approaches as opposed to project approaches because it most effectively deals with the problem of leakage. There are, as I said, forest projects in the mechanism by which one does in the CDM does a forest project. There are some additional rules that affect forest projects in the CDM, and it has particularly to do with the problem of permanence. How do you guarantee that a forest, the carbon has to stay there virtually forever? Okay, if you rely upon forests. And so there's some modifications to the rules that deals with forest projects that only give temporary certifications in the forest sector. And that's already in the CDM for afforestation and reforestation. As a result of that, you only get temporary, in the international system, you only get temporary CERs. Permanence is a huge issue. All the models say that if the rate of temperature change is too quick, there might be massive. Some of the models say there might be massive forest dieback. As it gets warmer, the forest fires will increase around the world. As it gets warmer, insects that attack the forests are likely to threaten forests. So, in my view, this problem of permanence is a real issue, and the policy question is, should we be giving people credits for not reducing their emissions by investing in forests, given the permanence issue? Now, having said that, it's my view that everyone looks at this, again says, but we've got to get the deforestation down. We don't have a choice. We've got to get this under control. The forest sector alone equals the assimilative capacity of the carbon cycle by itself, and so we've got to get on forests, and this is the only way people know how to do this. So what's been going on in the CDM with the non-deforestation projects? There's 4,673 CDM projects in the pipeline, and only a small sector are, in fact, afforestation or reforestation projects. The main reasons why the CDM has not moved quickly with other kinds of already allowable forest projects is that there are problems with proving permanence, additionality, and relatively high transaction costs. However, we will see towards the end of 2012 a whole bunch of new afforestation and reforestation projects finally get certifications, and that has to do, they're later than other projects, and it has to do with the way the CDM rules are created for the forest projects. This slide shows in a schematic form the fact that afforestation and reforestation is still a really small part of the CDM projects. Most of them are going for renewables, including hydroelectric plants. The forest sector is still quite small. So all this was going on, and there have been RED has been in existence since I think 2005, but it was never in the UN architecture. And the way it worked in the past is that there were usually bilateral donations, particularly the Norwegians and several of the European countries have been funding deforestation projects under the banner of RED. But 2 years ago in Bali, the world agreed that we would try to look to reverse what happened in The Hague and bring RED into the international superstructure. And the decision in Bali actually said that we were going to do RED that also not only reduced deforestation but relied upon conservation and sustainable management of forests to enhance carbon stocks. Now, I put those two words out because conservation and sustainable management of forests raises a whole set of other policy issues, particularly whether plantations qualify as sustainable management of forests. Why that is important politically will be clearer when we look at individual countries. These are the countries around the world which have high rates of deforestation. A lot of people don't know that there's by far there are 3 or 4 countries that have the majority of these projects: Brazil and Malaysia, Indonesia. Then there's a handful of countries that have rates of deforestation approaching Malaysia, but the 3 big ones are Brazil, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Some countries have a much higher percentage of their emissions coming from forests than other countries. And for that reason, how forests incorporated in their obligations is much more important to some countries. One of the options that's being considered is actually to make REDD part of what was agreed to in Bali. The developed countries agreed not to accept binding targets, but to take actions to reduce emissions. And one of the issues is, will deforestation and REDD become part of their recognized compliance with this agreement that they've already agreed to reduce emissions? Causes in different countries are really different from country to country. This shows you Brazil, and you can see that in Brazil it is in fact dairy farming, which is by far the larger cause of deforestation in Brazil, with logging actually being a relatively small percentage of what's going on in Brazil. But if you look in other places, you find that deforestation is caused for different reasons. In Latin America, agriculture or wood extraction and infrastructure expansion is much higher than it is in other parts of Brazil. The point of all this is that the causes of deforestation change, and therefore the instruments and the institutions you set up and the incentives ideally would fit the cause. But since there's such a variety of different reasons why deforestation takes place, it makes the architecture more challenging because of differences in cause. After Bali 2 years ago, when this was all done, 16 governments actually submit proposals about how to bring REDD into the UNFCCC architecture. And lo and behold, they came up with wildly different proposals about how to do this. Differences. One of the big issues in the architecture is how is this all financed, and what is the baseline? Brazil wants the baseline to be based upon historical rate of reductions. No surprise there, because their rates have been. They would benefit greatly if we set up the baseline on historical rate of destruction. Costa Rica would be just the opposite, who's been doing a pretty good job with in terms of protecting forests, and they're opposed to setting the baseline on a rate of destruction. What should be rewarded? Do we preserve forests, or do we reward the storage of carbon? How are the credits set up? That is a big call, because if you reward the storage of carbon, then you're sort of rewarding most likely plantations and monocultures and so forth. Again, different countries have different interests in this. Brazil wants the rewards to come, the baseline and the credits from slowing deforestation from a historical rate. It's obvious why they would want to do this. These issues have not been worked out yet, despite the fact there have been several meetings since Bali on this. There are big differences among the proposals that different countries have raised about how to do this, and because there are big differences among countries, there's a lot of contention about how to set up REDD that is playing itself out most recently in the PrepCons to Copenhagen, the most recent one just having concluded in Bangkok about a week and a half ago. The environmental community is greatly split on this also. There are Greenpeace, among others, are really opposed to the way that Nature Conservancy wants to run RED. Looking at the Greenpeace position, they're really worried about permanence. They're really worried about bringing it into the flexibility mechanisms until it's proven that we can solve some of the methodological problems, that we won't have leakage, that we can deal with monitoring. And other environmental groups want to move ahead much more aggressively. So there are big design issues, okay? There are issues about should the scope of RED be? Who is eligible? Is it the nation state alone? Is it a regional government? One of the hugely contentious issues in the negotiations is the rights of indigenous people and whether the money will flow to them, whether they have any right in sort of setting up a national strategy. This conflicts quite directly with the leakage problem, in my view, because the way you solve the leakage is to require management of forests over a larger area, either at the national scale to regional scale. If you give local people complete control over it and they're not part of a national scale, then you encourage leakage problems. I've already mentioned the baseline issues. How is it measured, over what periods, across what scale? Who is the money distributed to? Does it go to the national governments? In fact, my antennas say that what is likely to happen is that it will be national governments or perhaps regional entities that will be the entities that get the funds from RED if it's integrated into the national system. There are huge issues about financing this, whether it is most of the funding comes now from bilateral decisions of governments into funds. There are, whether we and at what rate we integrate this into the flexibility mechanisms is a huge issue that is still in contention. There's serious discussion of integrating it into the CDM. There is also has been serious discussion of creating a new kind of flexibility mechanism that's sort of CDM-like, but is separate because of the methodological problems. Other people say we shouldn't do this at the international level at all. We should do this at the national or the regional level. Let the European Union figure out how they're going to use fund RED projects. So I'm running out of time here. Let me just say that this slide shows that there are big differences between countries in terms of what's at stake for them, and as a result of that, many different proposals. Let me just end by saying where we headed, what's happened recently. To make a long story short, there has been some progress in the most recent meeting on several issues. A lot of people are talking about a phased approach where you take baby steps to integrate RED into the international system. There would be a capacity building stage, and that would likely be funded. Then, after a capacity building stage, the second phase nations would then have a responsibility to develop national policies. And then the third stage is only then would the compensation mechanism be triggered. It's already been decided to punt some of there are huge issues about measurement and verification that have been measured before. It looks like they're going to be punted to the SBSTA for future decisions. Huge disputes about plantations haven't been resolved. Huge disputes about indigenous people. And baselines, reference levels, and what scale. All of those issues are open as we speak. There is a meeting in Barcelona coming up in about 2 weeks. There is hope that some of this will be narrowed. I don't know that it will. And so I will just end there. And so what I would say is this is a can of worms, but I think we have to eat this can of worms is the way I see it. And I'd be interested to see if other people have other senses of this.
Thanks very much, Don. So now we will move to Ellie Baroudi from the World Bank, who will speak about her work in trying to actually stimulate this activity in advance of the treaties, which hopefully will happen.
I'm more optimistic, I think, than Jeff and Don, so I'm not sure if you can tell me at the end of this talk. But I work on, well, Jeff said 90% of my time is spent on forestry issues at the World Bank. I work mainly on the Biocarbon Fund, which is a fund that has been looking at forest carbon since 2004. We were set up to look at two sets of activities, one which was the main one at the time and remains the dominant one, forest carbon in the regulated mechanism. So forestry in the CDM, which Tiffany didn't mention very much, but is 90% of my job, so I'm not as dismissive. But we also are looking at areas that aren't yet in the mechanism. So we have piloted some RED projects and we're piloting agriculture projects. So I will come back to those because in a way that's been also the evolution of the negotiations. We also have at the bank, and I'll talk about this, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. And that is looking at national scale deforestation and degradation issues. And it's really in two parts. The first is looking at how you build up a readiness, a country to be ready to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation, and the other is how a pilot mechanism can come in for an incentive-based mechanism of payment. We also have other activities of at the bank, the Forest Investment Program. This is a relatively new program that's looking into investments, the investment side. So if countries do want to go down a road to make fundamental changes to be able to achieve what they need to stop the deforestation, can this be a pot that they can tap into? And we also have a fund that is looking more at partnerships between various stakeholders, but it's looking more at the local level and how to bring various stakeholders in. Those are the main activities apart from the lending, and that's really the main part of the bank's work, in effect, is lending to countries on operations of forestry and natural resource management and other areas. On that, we don't. You'll see a number of press articles. So sometimes we appear in a very bad light for sometimes very valid reasons, and sometimes where we feel we shouldn't be appearing in bad light, we still don't always get the message across. But I'm happy to answer any questions on those fronts. I'm not going to talk about the developments in the regulated frame because Don did that. I will just want to point out where we appear in that system and we in terms of the activities of the bank. The Biocarbon Fund was set up in 2004. That was really after the Kyoto Protocol and the Marrakesh Accords, which had just really spelled out the framework of what forestry rules are. But when we stepped in, we had the frame, but then nothing much else to go on. So really a lot of the activities we undertook was how do you do these types of forest projects when there aren't many pointers out there to show you how it should or could be done. We currently have around 25 reforestation projects in developing countries in the Biocarbon Fund. We have 5 deforestation projects, and we currently have 2 agriculture projects in the fund, but looking to increase those. The Forest Carbon Partnership Facility was created was launched in 2007, so relatively more recent, but again ahead of what's happening in the negotiations on RED, and this has been something that we've had to deal with, and a number of speakers spoke earlier. How do you undertake activities when there's moving policy and rules? Don mentioned some of the main issues for Copenhagen and what we talk about RED. I'm going to talk about some of these in a little bit of detail, but not too much. But then I'm also going to come back to thinking about, well, we're at a stage today where we were not when the Kyoto Protocol was set up. And, there's been a lot of lessons that have been learned. There's been an interesting body of experience, and I think that should help feed into the process going forward. Don mentioned also a lot of things happening in the phasing, and there's a lot of phasing happening. There's phasing of implementation, which I come to in a minute. There's phasing in financing, and everything seems to be happening in threes. I don't know why. But you've got, for example, sources of financing, so looking at everything from setting up fund mechanisms where really the public sector is the main contributor to these funds, but then also where the market and the private sector has a much bigger role to play, and a hybrid in between. On the scale of implementation, again in threes, but the way the rules are evolving is they talk about national approaches and national activities, but within that you can also have sub-national activities. So you have the national frame happening, and if you think about that and you think about what a country needs to do in order to reduce deforestation, it's quite a tall order. There's a lot happening on a national level. You've got lots of concessions, you've got legal, you've got illegal activities, you've got a number of other development issues. You need to build up your infrastructure. You're going to build a road, it's going to go through a nice forest where you know what the impact of that is going to be. You've got pressures, you need agricultural land. So there's a lot of these dynamics in the mix. And when you think about that on the national level, it's quite a complicated and complex system, which is why I think there has also been an evolution, because at one time there was really just to talk about national, but then when it came to implementation, it just becomes more doable on a smaller level. So that's when people started to talk more about the subnational approach. And then a number of entrepreneurs and other actors out there decided, well, this looks like something that's going to happen. We're going to do a project in red. So you have all that in the mix right now, and then how are they going to live together? Because this is if various projects, and there's some significant players out there. There's Merrill Lynch is involved in a project in Indonesia. You've got Marriott involved in a project in Brazil, and there's quite a bit of money starting to float around. The Biocarbon Fund has some very small projects, which we did well before anyone knew that there was going to be a national approach. You've got the Noel Kempfer project in exactly the same, the first trendsetter, in fact. So the moving pieces have to start being pulled together to fit now going forward. And one idea that is being tested or talked about is that you have the project approach sitting in a nested, what they call the nested approach. So I've got a slide on this, but I haven't put it in the right sequence. The national frame and within which projects are happening, but then you should not do any double counting. So you need to have a system where if projects are generating emissions that are being credited, then you need to make sure that on a national level that's accounted for. There's a lot of pluses and minuses related to each of these issues, and as if the issue isn't complex enough, if you drill down on every side, there's pluses and minuses. Don referred to some of these. On the national level, that it's easier to avoid leakage. So in one area, you've got somebody logging, and you decide to do a project there to stop the logging, where they're not just going to pick up their chainsaws and go somewhere else, the neighboring area. So on a national level, that would all be taken into account. On project level, it isn't. Unless you design, which hopefully the methodologies are taking into account. The negative sides of national level, I have already mentioned some. It relates to scale, and it's harder to implement. And the private sector, when it all becomes under government control, is less interested to step in. And I think it's very important to just emphasize the importance of the private sector and the volumes of money that can come in, which are much greater than the public sector volumes of money. And I think if those are well directed, then they're very welcome. On the subnational level, again, the project level and that subnational level, slightly easier to do, so you can start sooner. If you're talking about the national level, you're going to have to put in place a lot of your design and framework to see how you're going to get your deforestation down to a level that is reasonable. The minus side is obviously the other side of the coin to the national level. So you've got leakage issues the permanence risk is greater because you're looking at a smaller area, so under more risk, etc. I'm not going to go into any of these details, and even less on this slide because there's so much, but it's really to point out there's pros and cons on all sides of the coin that are being talked about. The 3 phases of REDD. This slide was drawn up before the Bangkok talks, and in the Bangkok talks they've started to formalize a little bit the phasing of the 3 phasing, or the discussion on the 3 phases. They don't quite correspond in the wording to here, but we still don't know how the ultimate wording will end up. And the Europeans also put out their paper on Copenhagen already, and that talks about phases, but everyone has slightly different language in their papers. At the bank, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, for example, in its first phase is looking at the readiness phase. So how do you help a country undertake the pieces it needs to start building up how it's going to reduce its deforestation? So it's a real diagnostic of the country, its activities, and we're talking about all sectors. It's not just forestry. It's everything that can potentially impact on that. Following from that, you know what you need to do. You have your plan of action. How are you going to do it? You need to build up your institutions. You may be changing around your institutions. It was interesting to hear the discussions on the U.S. institutions and the tug of war. Well, this is multiplied across every other country also. So this is, and in some countries the institutions don't exist, or in some it's centralized, which may have advantages, and others it's split across many, many institutions. So a big challenge there, and where investment money will be needed. And then finally, the maintenance and just the full implementation of this, and making sure that you don't go backwards and you maintain that. You maintain your deforestation. I'm sorry about all the graphics on this. I borrowed this slide, and this is just to show the various pots of funding that could come forward to help. There's a lot of money, as I said, mainly private sector money right now, focusing on deforestation and trying to help REDD. The bank is one of those, but there's also the UN REDD program, the Congo Basin the Forest Fund, etc. There's a number of players out there on the capacity building and reform and investment. Again, there's quite a few, the multilateral banks out there that are willing and interested. There's the Forest Investment Program, one of the bank instruments that will step in on investment funds. That fund is roughly $340 million right now, but when we say that, it's really a drop in the bucket for what really needs to happen on the reforms for REDD. And then there's a lot of discussions and innovative financing. So the creation of a REDD bond to generate financing is one new area that is being talked about. And finally, on the maintenance phase, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility has a carbon fund, as I mentioned, that could potentially bring in, once you do reduce your emissions, then you would be getting a payment for that, or some kind of incentive payments. Norway has also mentioned it's doing a lot. It's a very big player on the REDD front. The Europeans have suggested a global forest carbon mechanism, and then, is there room for this in the carbon market? There's a number of pilot activities that are happening. I'm not going to talk about these in any great detail because Julie is going to give an example of a project activity in greater detail. What I would like to emphasize is the importance of actually having pilots, and that once you roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty, then it's a great way to know what works and what doesn't. And unless you do that, we can ask all the questions in the world, but we don't really know how it's going to work. And I think that shouldn't really be underestimated. There's been a number of critical press articles lately on some deforestation projects that have been happening. But again, I think if you start and you can get 100% out of 100% on your first ever project, then you're doing really well. I don't know, I was trying to think of a comparison, but should we criticize Mr. Ford for the T model because he didn't go straight to the Rolls-Royce? So, I think there's a real evolution that needs to take place, and unless you do it, you don't really know. I mentioned these, and I don't want to go into them. As I said, there's a number of projects happening. I have mentioned a couple of them, but because of the time issue, I just want to talk about the current market very briefly, but also the impacts going forward. We heard a little bit about the prices of carbon and the market this morning. For RED, there is no market in the regulated space because it's not in there. So the only references we have is what's happening on the voluntary market. Ecosystem Marketplace, I don't know if you know the institution, they put out very good voluntary carbon market reports if you are interested in more details. But in effect, what we've seen is that the voluntary carbon market by volume has increased. The forestry share hasn't in terms of RED. It's in fact gone down a little bit. And that's really related to the difficulty in undertaking some of these projects. The average price in the forestry sector has been stated as $6.30 per credit based on the last report of the voluntary carbon market. However, that is across all the supply chains, so it really gives a bit of an inflated figure. If you want to know what a project developer gets, it's more around the $5 mark, which is in keeping with what most speakers said this morning. We're seeing there's a number of other activities also, and you can see just a comparison in the last two columns of the market share, and that's where you see RED has really has gone down a little bit since 2007 and 2008. The other land areas haven't gone down as much. So again, I think that's related more to the difficulty. At one time, there was a big buzz about RED, and a lot of people got excited about it, but come to do it, it's not as easy as I think some people thought. And just on my final slide, there's some important developments that have been happening. For the first time, we're seeing methodologies that are being published on the voluntary carbon standard related to the prescription of how you undergo measuring your carbon in a RED project. Without these methodologies, which are really like recipes for undertaking a carbon project, I mean, it's one part of the recipe, but you just wouldn't get any payments because you just don't know how much carbon realistically and viably you're reducing, you're saving from being cut down. The most important thing is that you also have independent certification and auditing on this, because it's very easy to say, yes, I did that, and I'm very proud of it, but you need someone else to independently say yes or no. The certification is the verification and validation, which Don mentioned, is a big part of the CDM. It's similar in the voluntary carbon standard. I think there's a lot of areas of comparison between the regulated market and the voluntary market. At least now, because the voluntary market has had to really tighten up on some of it, its rules, in order to make sure that the reputation of a carbon credit through a voluntary project is sound. One of the most important things, though, I think to mention is that there's huge examples now that we have of what hasn't worked from the clean development mechanism and what has. One of the things that hasn't been I think one of the things that is a bottleneck is how forest permanence is treated in the clean development mechanism. I want to emphasize, permanence is an issue. It's a very important issue to treat. But how it's treated through a temporary crediting mechanism has been a bottleneck in the CDM for these kinds of projects. And it's also the reason it's excluded from the European trading scheme. Now, I cringe when I hear the US market talk about treating forest credits with the same kind of temporary credits. And I think that in that respect, there are other ways to treat permanence other than temporary crediting. We're seeing those methods being developed in the voluntary carbon standard, for example, the buffer approach, which was mentioned this morning. The CDM is looking at bringing in other things onto the table. So I think, don't in the US go back to square one with some of the issues that have already been learned under the Kyoto process. That's one point. I'm going to end on that point because it's my favorite topic and I can probably go on about it forever. But there are other points, and if there's any interested speakers, interested questions, I can answer them later. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. That was great. And now Julie Baroudi.
Hi. Jeff overstated my role a little bit. When we created the climate initiative at the Rainforest Alliance, we launched it with a technical specialist, a coordinator, and a manager, and now we have another person working specifically on climate at the Rainforest Alliance. So the manager of our climate work is Jeff Hayward, so some of you may know him. With my presentation, I'm going to focus on a pilot project. You may feel like you're back in the session before lunch, but given that our session is about REDD in developing countries, I want to orient my talk about this specific project to issues specifically relating to developing countries and REDD, and I also want to kind of try to address some of the issues that were brought up in the session on pilot projects and some of the issues that were brought up by Don and Ellie as well. So the Rainforest Alliance, my organization, works on sustainable land management and trying to avoid deforestation. And we've been doing that since we were founded in 1986. And the reason is, and doing so in the agriculture, forestry, and tourism industries, working on helping people improve their land management practices so that they can get good value out of the forest or out of their forest abutting properties without hurting the conservation values of the forest. When we talk about REDD in tropical countries, in developing countries, there are a couple of important points. First, I'm actually surprised that we haven't yet heard today the statistic about 20% of emissions coming from deforestation, although it's been alluded to. The point that I wanted to make is that emissions from tropical deforestation are 20% of global carbon dioxide emissions, which is different than greenhouse gas emissions, as was pointed out. But the fact that those are tropical forest emissions is really important. So where we want to be focusing our efforts is on these tropical forests that have such great impact on the climate. Secondly, REDD activities, as have been mentioned, have all these great co-benefits. Beyond taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is, of course, our primary goal if we want to address climate change, these activities have benefits for the communities who are forest-dwelling communities and everybody who uses these resources. So that's something to keep in mind that I'm not going to address in this presentation at all, but something that we should think about when we're thinking about REDD projects in developing countries. Whoops. So the project that I want to focus on is in the Biosphere Reserve of Guatemala. This is 2 million hectares large. It has major biological and cultural value. There are Maya historic sites there. Indigenous people live there. There are protected species in the Biosphere Reserve. It was created in 1990, and when it was created, 3 different management zones were established: the core protected area, the multiple use zone, and the buffer zone. So you can see, so this is the core protected area here. And in this area, only conservation activities are allowed. In the multiple use zone, which is right there, it's much larger than, significantly larger than the core zone, and low impact activities are allowed there. Within this multiple use zone are community concessions. So the government owns the land, but it's granted communities, and in this case 2 private companies, concessions to do low impact forestry activities. Oops. And then finally we have the buffer zone, where there are all sorts of productive activities allowed. This region itself is called the Patent, and there are all sorts of threats to this forest. Even though it's technically a biological reserve, there's major migration. And up until a few years ago, the Patent had one of the highest migration rates in all of the world of people moving from other places to the Patent because there is all this undiscovered or unused land. There's farming and cattle ranching, which are both viable livelihoods for people in the region, and very attractive. There are invasions and drug trafficking. Drug traffickers use communities in the Patent as their home bases, and then the communities have a hard time evicting them. Oil and gas exploration, sanctioned by the government and non-sanctioned, and then illegal natural and archaeological resource extraction. So the Rainforest Alliance has been working in this area for quite some time with the communities, with the support of international development agencies that I'll talk about a little bit later. But when we first started working there was a requirement that there be conventional forest management, and in this zone where the concessions have forest management ability. So they were required to do have a forest management plan. Then we helped these communities to earn Forest Stewardship Council certification. We heard about that a little bit before in the context of Pennsylvania and how important Forest Stewardship Council certification is for sustainable land management. And we also helped the Association of Forest Producers in this area to find markets for their products. So not only markets within Guatemala, but also international markets. So the first concessions were certified in 1998, which is not that long ago, considering when the reserve was designated in 1990. And then started doing some commercialization of lesser-known species, so being more efficient with their use of the forest. And this is working toward using the full economic of the value of the forest in the most sustainable way, so that people who live there don't have to cut it down and do other activities like cattle and things like that. So then the third phase was to start doing added value processing and certified non-timber products. And so this is helping to build a timber processing plant, for example. So you could build furniture, doing extraction of shate, which is a palm that's used on Palm Sunday, and so they now export shate to the United States in large quantities. And these have all been really successful activities. There are great numbers on increased export of products to other parts of the world and increased livelihoods for communities. And it's also had a positive forest management implication. So again, I said that here, and you can see they're a little bit hashed, but here is the zone where there are certified concessions. So we're talking now about the Forest Stewardship Council certified management. It's achieved that level. And then again, over here was the core protected area, and here is the buffer zone. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but up in this corner is the date, and this is showing forest cover and deforestation. You'll start to see deforestation showing up in red as we go through the years. So as it goes through, you can see if you watch this concession border how there's increasing deforestation everywhere, but where there's certified land management going on, where these communities have an incentive to do sustainable land management and to be very conscious of what's happening in the forest. In the other areas, there's overuse of the forest or just lack of management. And the same thing shows up in terms of wildfires. So this gets a little bit to the question that was asked about fires in the previous session, in that where you have land management plans, there's much lower incidence of fires than where there aren't land management plans. And this is just a different way of representing the same thing. The yellow line is the buffer zone, and you can see that the deforestation there, this is from 1990 to 2006, is much higher than where it is in these kind of purplish lines, which are the non-certified multiple-use zone and the core protected area. And then if you look down here, almost at the zero line, are the Forest Stewardship Council certified concessions. So we can see that this level of management is having a significant impact in this area already. So then the question is it enough? Carbon isn't the answer. Carbon finance isn't the answer for every conservation problem. And we need to be really clear about that and be very clear that all projects that are implemented with carbon finance are new and additional and wouldn't happen if there wasn't that management. And our answer that we've come up with, together with the government, together with the concessions, is no. This management is happening. It's being supported by the Rainforest Alliance. It's being supported by USAID. But these funding isn't going to go on forever. We need to consolidate these gains that we've had over the last 10 years and help the communities to become more sustainable and do this work on their own. Help the Protected Areas Management Association to be a lot more self-sufficient and have stronger forest protections. So this is why we've considered this avoided deforestation project, and that is our additionality argument, and in a general terms. So I'm going to go through here now. This is just quickly the project potential. When you look at when a PIN was mentioned before, a project idea note, these are the kind of things that are explained, what the size of the project is, what the total carbon is in the area now, and then over the lifetime of the project, if the project activities are implemented, what is our potential to avoid future deforestation. And here, this shows that the project potential over 20 years is avoided emissions of 16 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is a a little bit of a start of what our baseline is, but the baseline, forming an actual baseline, includes doing a whole set of modeling into the future of what the deforestation would be like. Would the concessions keep losing their certifications, as has been the case? Would invasions continue? That kind of thing. And what would that look like over time? As I mentioned, we've been working with project partners, which is really important, working with government agencies, international funders, and domestic funders, and the communities themselves. And having that kind of a coalition, as was mentioned in Louisiana, for example, is really important. And we're working on a rather large scale here, and so having everybody on board is key. And it's also been a huge process of education for the government over the last few years that we've been working on this project, so having them involved at all levels is really important. Going to the project structure really quickly, we have these activities, which are the project activities here in green, are what we're actually doing. If we implement an avoided deforestation project, what are we going to do? Then when their carbon credits sold, the benefits go to this trust fund, which is manages the disbursement of funds, and the funds then end up going to the concessions themselves, the Protected Areas Management Organization, sorry for the acronym, which is a government agency, and then actual project administration where they're reinvested back here. So this is where we get to issues involving permanence, and I'm not going to get into the details of this, but including the government agencies in here is a big issue on permanence. Having FSC certified management, which has a financial incentive in and of itself, encourages permanence. Having these social safeguards encourages permanence, because if communities can see the value in the project, then they have incentives to manage for the long term. And also involving the government and the protected areas in all of the country and the Ministry of Environment in all of the country helps with the leakage issue as well. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about this if anybody's interested. This is where we are in the project. I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but we've been working on this project for a few years now, and we're just getting to the point of developing the project design document. We've developed a new methodology for this specific type of project, and it hasn't been approved yet. It was mentioned that these methodologies all need to be approved. There is a high amount of regulation to these projects, and we are fully in favor of that. The Rainforest Alliance is a validator and verifier of projects, and we do assessments of methodologies, and we won't be playing that role in this project because we don't want to create any kind of a conflict of interest, but and I also not going to talk about it because there's a whole nother panel about it, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has about that later as well. So then this is my final slide. I wanted to draw some conclusions from this project for what we see in the international and domestic, in the process of forming international and domestic legislation. For the Rainforest Alliance, we feel that it's very important that REDD initiatives concentrate on tropical forest countries with the greatest amount of forest cover and those under the greatest loss of forest, or under the greatest threat of loss of forest and degradation. So that's not to say that forestry projects in the United States aren't really important. But when you're thinking large scale and when you're thinking about the scale of the climate change problem and taking carbon out of the air and actually keeping it sequestered, we need to really focus on where can we get the biggest benefit in the shortest amount of time. This is a little bit challenging in that we talked about forest as a relatively inexpensive way to mitigate emissions. It's forest projects may be relatively inexpensive, but the whole infrastructure around them is not that inexpensive. We've been working on this project for a few years, and as I said, we're at this stage where we haven't sold any carbon credits yet. It's involved a lot of international funding to get it to this point before we get the market involved. And anybody who's been working on projects can tell you similar stories, I'm sure. But it goes back to the idea that these learning projects are really important. Once we establish the legal frameworks and once we establish the funding mechanisms, hopefully things will go much more quickly. Next, we want to make sure that these implementation mechanisms are efficient, measurable, and equitable globally and locally, which includes having considerations for indigenous peoples and communities. I mentioned before that co-benefits of REDD projects and forestry projects are co-benefits. We want to focus on carbon. But the unique thing about forestry projects is that they can't, well, probably not unique, but an important aspect of them is that there is much about these projects that just won't work, that won't be sustainable unless they have major involvement of people on the ground in those regions. Even if they're on private land owned by a corporate private landowner, they still need to have buy-in of anybody who lives in a community nearby. And so that's something to consider in forming legislation. And then finally, and this was alluded to before as well, but we need to make sure that all of these RED initiatives either include or are complemented by sustainable agriculture, forestry, and tourism, and many other industrial activities that are viable participatory approaches to conserving ecosystems. So, when I say this, I'm thinking of things like Forest Stewardship Council certification, like Rainforest Alliance certification in agriculture, that are initiatives that are already underway, that are address commodities or address forest governance, that are very complementary to RED initiatives. And they should be built up along with RED initiatives. And that's it for me. But I did want to point out that the nested approach that Ellie mentioned is something that many NGOs are in favor of, and it's an important thing to work with. We really are supportive of pilot projects and of including a project base as we go forward with things like national baselines. That's a little tangent to end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. Okay, questions? Gentleman in the back.
Don't have a microphone, so I'll just shout. But could you characterize this for the whole panel? Could you characterize the different focus between forestry and agriculture? I mean, we talked a lot about agriculture this morning, but a lot of the focus has been on forest in the international stuff.
I'm glad you asked that question because it's something I forgot to say. So thanks for that. What the focus is really on RED now because it's the way the negotiations on the international level have evolved. So right at the start, you had reforestation, which was included, and deforestation, the discussions around that, they decided they wouldn't include. Now, RED has picked up a lot more momentum, so RED is really where a lot of the spotlight has been. But if you look at what's on the list in the international negotiations for other activities coming in, agriculture is amongst them. So agriculture today in the international negotiations is where RED was a few years ago, in effect, I think would be fair to say. Alongside agriculture, you have, which was with reference to the speaker from Louisiana, restoration of wetlands also listed. Whether these survive to Copenhagen and don't get kicked out, we don't know yet, but they are definitely on the plate for discussion and hopefully inclusion.
I would add that I agree with everything that Ellie said, in that a few years ago, people said forests were too hard to measure, avoided deforestation was too hard to measure. Soil carbon is very challenging to measure, so developing methodologies for soil carbon that aren't too burdensome to make project development feasible is a challenge, but there are lots of really smart people working on that issue right now. Peatlands is another thing that are really difficult to measure, but have huge potential, so that's another kind of hot button issue to look at. And then finally, when you talk about agriculture in general, it's a little bit vague because there are issues like soil carbon in an agricultural context, but there's also agroforestry where we've been working on projects, reforestation projects on coffee farms, and really forest carbon projects in an agricultural environment. And then there are many different areas of agriculture that have other greenhouse gas emissions consequences that we can look at for projects as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question and then just trying to keep the schedule on time. So if anyone has other questions, we'll have a break. This lady right here. Yeah.
Do you think the permanence problem could be solved by granting carbon credits retroactively for carbon added to the sink in the previous year?
So there are a couple different types of crediting, and the different types of deals that can be brokered for carbon credits were touched on in the previous session. But two different types of credits can be issued, ex-ante credits or ex-post credits. Ex-ante credits, of course, are more challenging because you're paying for a carbon credit that hasn't been created yet. Paying for a carbon credit that already was created, an ex-post credit guarantees that that credit is there. But it doesn't solve the permanence issue because it doesn't mean that, because you still need to have some kind of a buffer reserve. So there are those two different types of crediting, but the permanence question is really better answered by a buffer of some sort than by just having a verified ex-post credit.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the panelists. That was really terrific. Thanks.